I have never been an easily frightened person. My family's a good size, local parish had a lot of ideas about the evils of birth control, and not too well off, so by the time I left home I'd never really slept alone before. Growing up, I shared a room with my sister and one of my brothers, my sister's little twin bed on one wall, and on our side, a bunk bed I managed to break pretty fantastically as a rowdy 15-year-old before being banished to a mattress in the middle of the floor. Even when I woke up in the middle of the night and walked through a dark house for a glass of water, there were always at least two, though usually more, sets of snores less than a few dozen feet away. Dad kept a shotgun in a safe next to his bed, and if so much as an errant raccoon walked past the house, the dogs would sound the alarm. Mom made sure they would never hurt a fly, but we never had less than two big, scary-looking hounds at any one time. Point is, as a kid, I never worried about unexplainable noises. Despite living in nowhere, in the state with the second worst response times in the U.S. Not to say that the local cops would have been any help. We had a few run-ins in my late teens, when I was functionally homeless, and I can't say I was under the impression the local sheriff wouldn't like an excuse to get rid of me, one way or the other. It was the 80s, and queers were a few rungs on the ladder below even women on birth control. Which is a roundabout way of saying that my second point is, 911 was the absolute last-ditch scenario for me. Some of the local cops had told me to my face that I was better off dead, and I was not about to test them on it. Whatever your views on the police, that was my experience and mindset at the time. I was 19, washing dishes at an old truck stop diner. The owner would give me hot food and a couple bucks in exchange, and it wasn't even minimum wage. But what was I going to do? Call the cops? And I'd overheard one of the customers talking about how she'd been in town facilitating her mother's move into a nursing home a couple of hours away. The old lady would be gone, presumably for the rest of her days, and the house would have to stay empty for the next few months while they sorted out the logistics, something about wanting to rent it out or maybe use it as a vacation home. It was accessible by a gravel road, and only a few minutes out of town and into the woods, as she'd said. Lucky they'd painted the gate a nice bright red, otherwise they'd miss the turn whenever they drove up, she'd said. And, look, I'm not proud of myself, but it was getting cold. Dishwashing was the only time I'd gotten to feel my fingers for a good few weeks at that point. Only a few more and I'd fall asleep in my makeshift woodland tent, undisturbed until spring thaw freed me from a tomb of snow and ice. So that night, I went to the house. It sat at the end of a long dirt road, long enough that you couldn't see the highway. From the driveway, I could see all the curtains were drawn shut. There weren't any cars parked on the property. I had planned to stay in the woods across the street for a few days and keep an eye on the place before breaking in, but by the time I'd made the walk to the edge of town, carrying everything I owned on my back, the cold had me so exhausted that I barely felt like a person. The grass crunched like frozen glass as I made my way to the front door and knocked. Shave and a haircut, wait, then no nonsense, wait, and then as loudly and aggressively as I could muster before concluding that there truly was nobody home. I walked around back, the side facing the woods, and was surprised to find that one of the second-floor windows had been unlatched. As a Catholic, I was no stranger to guilt. But when you're deprived of your physical needs long enough, whether it's adequate food, warmth, or a door to lock behind yourself, the part of your brain that's meant to keep you alive overrides any concerns you might have about things like property law. I climbed in through the window, clumsy with exhaustion, and found myself in what looked like a guest bedroom. The heater had been left on. I was surprised at the time, thinking it would be wasteful, but now I know that when you leave a house to sit like that you need to keep the air dry enough to avoid moisture damage. Nonetheless, I was grateful. The next morning, I was awoken by a chill breeze blowing in through the open window. I got up, shut it and latched it. At the time I'd assumed I'd forgotten to close it before dragging myself to the bed and falling into unconsciousness, never mind that I'd slept comfortably all night. First thing I did that day was take a hot shower, the first time in months I'd had anything but a gas station sink bath. I remember thinking it would have been worth it just for that, with my apologies to the nice lady and her mother. I got out of the shower and found that the bathroom door had been left open. This time, I was absolutely certain I'd closed it. All houses have their quirks. I thought that it must have had a loose latch and that the bathroom fan had caused enough of a pressure differential to swing the door open. Just a simple draft. Overall, it was a quiet morning. For the first week, I was very careful. I didn't want to settle in, but it's hard to exist in a space for any great length of time without making some kind of impact on it. Especially, unfortunately, if you're a teenager. There wasn't much. I just finally broke down and took my dishwashing money to the grocery store to stock up for the winter. I'd hauled back as many crackers and soup cans as I could fit in my bag. The pantry was full, and that felt good, despite it being irrefutable proof that someone had been living inside the house. But there were little things that I kept noticing, to the point that I thought I might have gotten brain damage from the cold. Doors and windows left open, that sort of thing. One morning I came downstairs and found that the front door had been left open all night, which damn near gave me a heart attack. I was worried all day, thinking about the rancher lady driving by her mother's house to check on it and seeing that. With my luck, the ensuing manhunt wouldn't have left me alive. I was still holding out hope that I'd be able to quietly slip out in the spring with no one the wiser. I kept the blinds shut always, of course, and took care not to leave the lights on at night, which was as off-putting as you would expect. Regardless of my feelings about my family at the time, I missed a busy house. The quiet unnerved me. When a place is full of people, and you know it's full of people, you don't think of all the creaks and knocks. I had no idea how much noise an empty house makes. I had no point of comparison. So when there was a creak or a thump that sounded impossibly loud, the slam of a door, the rattle of a window frame, I thought very much of it. Too much, to the point where I immediately overcorrected. I think, the wind, the house is just settling, the heater, a branch. This is normal, nothing is wrong. But then, another early morning, after a night of fitful sleep, I opened the guest bedroom door to the hallway and found a dead rat at my feet. It was just dead. Nothing too awful, you couldn't even tell how it died, at first glance. It was just gross, more than anything else. I went through all the rooms, checking for rat droppings, and didn't find any. The pantry was undisturbed. Thank God, I'd thought. I was going to write it off as readily as everything else. A rat got in, couldn't get back out, and ended up dying in an unfortunate place. But then I walked back up the stairs, and looked again at where the rat had ended up. Right outside my door. Like it was intentional. So I got a trash bag out of the pantry and used it as a barrier to pick the rat up. Its neck had been bit open and left it outside. If there had been one other person there with me, I think I might have elected to stay. It would have been the rational thing to do. But I got a bad feeling. And when there's no one but yourself you need to convince, a bad feeling is more than enough. So I packed up what I could, and opened the door. To a blizzard. In the time since I'd woken up, with all the blinds and curtains tightly shut, I hadn't noticed that the previous night's light snowfall had turned into an eerily silent storm. Even once I'd gotten to the plowed road, my feet wouldn't have made it. My shoes had holes and busted seams. By the time I'd have made it into town, I'd have lost half my toes for good, and that wasn't an exaggeration. So I sat with my bad feeling for a bit, then set my pack down. I walked into the kitchen far more calmly than I felt and grabbed a steak knife. One of the good ones, sharp, with a solid blade. Without ceremony, I put it in my pocket. That night, I did not sleep. I stayed up in the closet of the guest bedroom, knife in hand. The house was almost silent. There was only the gentle vibration of the old heater running. Outside, the snow absorbed all noise. I'd almost started to nod off when I heard the window shake. There was the slide of something sharp, then a crack, like a claw slowly separating a piece of wood from a frame. Then I heard the distinct sound of the window sliding up, and the creak of the old floorboards under the carpet as a weight shifted onto them. I stopped breathing, my grip tight on the steak knife. Through the crack in the closet, with the barest bit of refracted moonlight, I was able to see nothing but an imposingly large shape. The very air in the room seemed to change when it entered, as though it became somehow heavier, though it brought only a smell of faint woodrot that I'd grown to associate with the house already. There were slow, too familiar, heavy but careful footfalls as the thing walked across the bedroom and towards the door to the hallway, moving with a controlled grace that was startling, given its size. It fiddled with the handle for a moment, making a soft metallic rattle that I also instantly recognized before opening the door and then closing it. I didn't hear its footsteps leave. I wondered if it noticed that the handle had been locked from the inside. I wondered if it understood what that meant. It turned back into the room. For a moment, I thought it was going to go back out the window, and I almost cried with relief, but then it turned. It started to approach the closet door. My breathing grew quick and shallow. I was frozen, watching through the crack in the door as my death slipped towards me on long legs that were far too quiet. But then it continued moving, as though the bed on the opposite wall had been its destination all along. There was a creak as it ever so carefully climbed onto the bed, the mattress springs groaning under what sounded like something far heavier than a person. The thing exhaled, low and rattling, like the creature's lungs were vast enough to hold an echo all by themselves. And, well, like I said, I didn't sleep that night. The monster stayed on the bed, and I sat crouched in the closet. For what must have been at least 3 hours, I didn't dare move, beyond leaning slightly against the wall behind me to keep my knees from locking up. Early in the morning, it was winter, so it was still dark out. The thing sighed again, then rose from the bed, the mattress decompressing underneath it. Its shadow passed over the crack, and then it opened the door to the hallway, this time leaving through it. The floorboards groaned as it skulked down the hallway, and then I heard the squeak of one particular stair that I recognized immediately, having heard it from my room as I was falling asleep only a few days ago. I heard it open up the pantry and rummage around. I thought I'd been running out of food more quickly than I should have, but hadn't noticed anything like a wild animal chewing through packages. It obviously knew enough to take the food without making too obvious a mess, and then the pantry door closed, and the front door closed with nothing but the whine of hinges and the rattle of a doorframe. I felt myself deflate, the exhaustion of a night without rest or reprieve hitting me all at once. Shaking, I took a deep breath, and stood up from my crouch, my knees creaking uncomfortably. Still quiet and careful, I opened the closet door. And found, left directly in front of it, a dead fox, neck half severed like the rat's, the placement obviously intentional. I covered my mouth with my hands, grimacing as the realization that it had known where I'd been all night hit me. A dead weight like a rock settled in my stomach, and my face grew cold. Okay, I remember thinking, I might not be so lucky next time. Maybe I can survive without feet. Almost everything was still packed up from my decision to leave the previous day. I ran downstairs and opened the pantry, eating what I could force down my throat and packing whatever else I could fit into my bag, preparing for my hike back into town. My 2-hour hike through the woods. The same woods the creature had presumably just ran off into. There was a noise from upstairs. But it had gone, hadn't it? Had I imagined it? More nerves than man, I crept over to the front window and drew the curtains apart, just enough for me to peek out. Yesterday's blizzard had let up in the night, and sure enough, there was a set of footprints in the snow. I couldn't really tell the size and shape from the distance I was, but I could see them lead away from the front door. And then back around the side of the house. To the woods, surely. Or had it left for a moment, only to re-enter? Had it drawn me out intentionally? I was stuck to the spot, not daring to turn around for fear that I would find the thing behind me. I couldn't have been there for more than a minute, staring out the window, before my heart froze for an entirely different reason. For the first time in almost a month, a car was coming up where the driveway had been, slowly navigating with its chained-up tires, someone driving out to check on the house after the blizzard. What would a person have thought when they saw me in here? Especially as I'd been knife in hand, sunken eyes, half crazed from lack of sleep. Trespassing, this far out of town. Everybody was packing around there. They for sure had a gun in the car, if not on them. I don't think I'd ever moved so fast in my life. By the time I'd set the kitchen to rights, everything stashed in the pantry, nothing, as far as I could tell, that would alert them to my presence. I heard a car door shut out front. I ran up the stairs as quietly and quickly as I could with my pack. As I reached the top, I heard 2 voices. What are these footprints? Do you think someone else thought to check on the house? One of the cousins. The front door opened just as I turned the corner into the hallway, out of sight. Doors unlocked. What? Fuck. I grit my teeth, trying to think of a place to hide. Hello? Someone called. Perfect, I thought, looking up at the panel on the hallway ceiling that I knew to be the entrance to the attic. As quietly as I could, I reached up. I don't know if I mentioned, I'm pretty tall, and this was an older house with low ceilings, and I opened the attic door, not bothering to pull down the stepladder before gently placing my pack up on the ridge and then pulling myself into the space, closing the hatch behind me. Quietly as I could was evidently not as quiet as I'd hoped, because as the latch closed, I heard a muffled voice from below comment. What was that? And then the telltale squeak on what I knew to be exactly the second stair from the bottom. It was only then, of course, that I noticed there was something off about the attic. Adrenaline sure does narrow your focus. The first thing I felt was the air pressing in on all sides just a little too tightly, like the moment the cabin depressurizes as a plane lands, but never ending. Something shifted, not 6 feet from me. I looked up and met its eyes, and my stomach dropped out from under me. The bright daylight from outside seeped through the vent on the wall just enough to reflect off the back of its retinas, like a mountain lion's. It stared straight at me, not moving, watching me from the dark. I opened my mouth to scream, yell, but was startled into silence by a voice directly underneath me. I guess it was just the heater. Something or other. And then, from a little farther down the hallway, at the top of the stairs. Yeah. Pipes, something like that. You know what these old houses are like. The thing took a slow, careful step towards me. The floorboard creaked. See? The daylight warms up the boards a little, they start to shift and expand. Sol normal. I grew up here, I'd know. Impossibly slow, the creature looked down, its head cocked like a dog's. Then it looked back up at me. I dunno. I have a weird feeling. Do you smell that? It just smells like Mom's house. They were moving around down there, all calm and casual. Should probably tear apart the walls and check for mold at some point. There was a pause. Yeah. I guess. In the cold of the attic I could feel heat radiating off of the creature. It was impossibly large for the space. It had long, sinewy dark limbs, with the shape of its head and torso obscured by thick, almost mink-like fur that stuck out in all directions, making it look like it had no neck. Its face was a pale gray, absolutely hairless, and that was the part one was concerned with at the time, frozen in fear as it leaned towards me, distributing its weight on its spindly knuckles while underneath I could hear the people chatting and rummaging around. The thing felt all-encompassing, like a black hole that bent the very shape of space and light around itself. It looked straight at me, and I at it. Underneath us, a door creaked open, and I heard. Might as well pick up some stuff while we're here. It took another step. Its limbs moved like a spider's, though there were only 4 of them I could see. Impressively large jaws opened. I felt its breath on my face, hot and putrid. No, I'm telling you, something feels off. The door was unlocked. You can go get the rifle out the truck if it makes you feel better. Just don't put any holes in the wallpaper. Despite it all, I dared not move, nor call out. 5 minutes must have passed without either of us moving, the people below busying about. At some point, one of the people downstairs dropped something with a thud, and the spell broke. It moved even closer, inching far into my space. It inhaled, curious and hungry. I reflexively tried to shift away. Its arms shot up like a pair of rattlesnakes. I felt my trachea compress under surprisingly strong claws that pierced the skin on my neck. My hands immediately shot up, scrambling at my neck and trying to pry the thing off. Its claws were in deep enough that I felt my sweater above my collarbone grow wet with what must have been my own blood. I couldn't have cried out even if I wanted to, not with the hold that it had on my neck, but the scuffle must have made enough noise, because I heard somebody yelling downstairs. The floor was literally swept out from under me as I was dragged by my neck to the far wall of the attic. And, like I said, I'm not a small guy, even if I hadn't been eating well at the time. The thing was strong. The panel into the attic opened up, and suddenly the voices were much louder. At the same time, the creature loosened its hold on me to only one hand as it opened up a grate on the wall. I was able to loosen it more, scrambling at it with my fingernails, before it regained its hold in full and forced me through the opening, tossing me off what was essentially the roof of a second-story house. My head must have hit something, obviously not hard enough to do too much damage, and I think the bushes very luckily caught most of my fall because after that point things got really fuzzy. I remember a lot of yelling, some screaming. Some gunshots. Later on, the story that got told was this. A local, the lady's sister, and her husband went to check on their mother's house, which stood empty for more than a month while she was making the transition to a nursing home. While there, they discovered that someone had been living in the house alongside their mother for several years. In the walls, basement, and attic, there were found several items that had gone missing as far back as 30 years ago, amongst old food wrappers of a similar date, and animal bones that had been picked clean and allowed to dry out. The couple had found me on the way back, half frozen to death on the side of the highway, apparently my concussed self had the sense to head for the hills once the thing had been sufficiently distracted by gunfire. Any suspicion that might have fallen on me was stopped by my alibi of being 10 years old when the oldest wall-stuffing items had been discovered. But, after a brief stint in the hospital, I told the lady everything. I was as honest as I could be and expected to get blamed for all of it. She was upset, very understandably so, but contacted me again soon after and told me she probably would have let me stay there if I had asked. She said that she would have preferred the house not been empty anyway and was not going to press charges, as she felt I'd been through enough already. I don't know if she felt somehow responsible for my neck wounds, or if she was just an impossibly good person, because after all that she called me up one night and told me she'd called in a favor to get me a real job and had found me a place to stay. Nowadays we're still in contact, actually, and we're pretty friendly. I actually house sat for her and her husband last weekend. I fed her cats and watered her plants, and cleaned up the place a bit while I was there. I still don't know what the thing in the attic was, but they ended up selling her mom's old place, and I've made sure not to be out in the woods alone without at least one other person or a few dogs ever since. My name is Michael Sully, and me and my friend were the sole survivors of a horrific event. It's been nearly 40 years now, and until recently, I was sure this story would never see the light of day. It was only after my recent visit to the doctor, where I received some very bad news, that I was suddenly struck with a certain sense of sentimentality for what happened. It sounds odd, I know. Don't get me wrong, what happened was horrible, and I would do anything in the world for it not to have occurred. But alas, that isn't possible. What happened happened, and as it stands. I don't feel as if I can let this particular tale be lost to the sands of time. So I'm writing this here, now, in the hopes that after I'm gone, the tragedy that occurred can be remembered. And, who knows, perhaps others have been through similar things. It would be nice to know I'm not alone. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I'm sure you're itching to hear what I'm on about, right? It all started at a party. I was only 22 at the time, recently returned to university after a long year of traveling the Americas. My friends were glad to see me, and as soon as the weekend rolled around I could hardly say no to a good old-fashioned night out. Unbeknownst to me, my friends invited friends of their own, and some of those friends asked their own friends to come along. When the day arrived, what began as a small get-together between a tightly knit group of 5 friends had turned into a romping boozer with a group of 11 or 12, half of which I didn't know at all. Although I was a little disheartened at not being able to catch up with my friends as intimately as I had hoped, the company did turn out to be quite endearing. Between 5 hours, 7 bars, and more taxi fares than I care to remember, I drank, made conversation, and bonded with these newcomers. It felt as if within 1 week of returning, I had, in fact, made more friends than I had in the 3 years of college prior. As the end of the night rolled around, our group exited the final bar, laughing and chatting amongst ourselves. The atmosphere felt giddy, and yet very calm. As the small white van we'd called to take us back to the dorm rattled slowly to a stop at the curve, we bid a drunken goodbye to those of us heading in a different direction and opened its back doors, stepping inside the gloomy interior of the vehicle. The van wasn't quite tall enough for most of us to stand, so we ducked down and laughed as we scraped our heads against the roof until we eventually fell into our seats at the side. My best friend, Joel, sat opposite me, staring at me with a gormless smile that made me laugh. As I leaned my head back against the smooth surface of the van's wall, I opened my mouth and beamed back, not just at him, but at everyone in the van, even the middle-aged, balding driver who turned to us from the front seat and asked where we wanted to go. Someone else answered him, while I simply lay back and basked in the glory of the universe. For the first time in my life, I felt truly happy. It was a strange experience, as if realizing that every positive emotion you've ever felt had simply been a fake, a pale imitation of the true sensation which I was only now feeling. I was so grateful for the present, which felt utterly flawless, so hopeful for the future, which seemed brighter than ever, and so forgiving of the past, which now felt like nothing but a rocky road leading to my ultimate destination in the here and now. It was nothing less than euphoric. As my friend's drunken chatter became background noise in my enlightened mind, I breathed in deep and disappeared into pure ecstasy. The next moments felt like they lasted an eternity, and at the same time, they flashed before my eyes in a matter of moments. I daren't try to explain it further. It makes no more sense to me than it does to you. With that same carefree, stupid smile on my face and the gentle rumbling of the engine passing through my bones, I sat there, feeling like I had never felt before. Then, the noise stopped. I don't quite know how to describe it. 1 second, my ears were filled with the muffled sounds of traffic and the hum of the van, and then, nothing. The vibrations passing through the vehicle ceased as well, sending a chill through my body just before the whole thing lurched forward. It felt like a descending elevator slowing to a stop far too quick. I, like almost everyone else in the van, was jolted upwards, making a resounding thump against the roof as my head smashed against it. As we fell back down into our seats and the world fell still again, our eyes began to wander between each other. Now, I know it may seem stupid given what had just happened, but every single one of us still had a smile on our face. The feeling I felt, what we must all have felt, was like a pull, drawing us into ecstasy and refusing to let us go, refusing to even acknowledge the possibility that anything bad might have happened. Despite that, my naturally curious nature beckoned me to stand up from my seat and poke my head between the backs of the driver and passenger seats to see into the front of the vehicle. The driver, looking even older and frilier than he did before, lay face down against the steering wheel, unconscious. Buzzed as I was, I reached forward and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him gently while muttering something totally inappropriate to the situation. I can't remember exactly, but I assume I jokingly told him he needed to get more sleep, or to wake up so he could join the party. It wasn't until I finally raised my head and saw out of the windscreen that my smile finally faded. What I saw was only darkness. No rear lights from the cars ahead or glaring yellow from street lamps, no traffic lights or buildings. I saw only black. At first I assumed a logical explanation, that the van had crashed into something black, or a blanket had been tossed over the windshield, forcing the driver to brake. But as my eyes narrowed and I leaned in closer, I was proven wrong. It wasn't just darkness. It was more nuanced than that. The more I stared, the more I could make out other colors. Brown, sickly green, and purple, floating and blending like clouds in a nebula. I turned around to my friends, suddenly concerned, although the feeling of euphoria still lingered somewhere in me. They were still buzzing, a couple now drunkenly stumbling toward the back doors. When Joel reached for the handle and pulled, my eyes went wide. Before I could leap forward or shout a warning, the 2 doors at the back of the van swung open, suddenly revealing an all too vivid window into the horrid void I had seen through the front. The air did not change. No wind flew in from the outside, nor did it vent from within. Save for the suddenly looming sight of this seemingly infinite expanse just beyond the safety of our small shuttle, nothing seemed to have changed. Even the van, which was clearly no longer on solid ground, did not shift or tilt. It was perfectly still, and by that point, so was I. Joel slowly turned around, a mumbled chuckle beginning to reach up from his throat. I couldn't possibly understand what he was so jolly about, but I knew immediately something was very wrong. As his head turned, his eyes met with mine, and I saw a sight that haunts me to this very day. Joel's eyes were inky black, shiny and reflective enough that I could see myself clearly in them. They were leaking viscous, black fluid, flowing down his face like tears. He wasn't crying though. His mouth was still upturned, a grin so wide I could see his lips trembling from the strain. He stared at me, the rest of his body unnaturally still. At this point, I could see a few of the others had noticed, but strangely, none of them seemed concerned, except for Harry, a lanky man I'd met only that day. The others' expressions were shifting, twitching, as if some internal battle was taking place to decide how they should feel about this horrifying situation. I was dumbfounded, paralyzed on the spot. As I fell still, Joel began to move again. He turned around and stepped closer to the edge of the van, practically teetering over the abyss. Then, he turned to face me one final time. Even though I'm certain his mouth was already as wide as it could go, I could have sworn that he smiled at me at that moment. A smile that meant more than simply what was on his face. Without a word, he stepped out into the void. He didn't fall like I expected him to. He simply hovered there, floating slowly away as his other foot let go of the van and his body became wholly unsupported. I did nothing. I merely watched in abject horror as my best friend was snatched by the abyss. That is my biggest regret to this day. Suddenly, my attention was stolen away as another friend of mine, Elsa, snickered. It was an infectious laugh, one that demanded reciprocation. I was so terrified that it had no effect on me, but I could see the others struggling to hold in laughs of their own. One by one, they succumbed, giggling and wheezing as a bout of laughter overtook them. Their stifled smiles were broken wide open into huge grins, and I could see as their eyes darkened, as a thick liquid began to seep from them, and they slowly rose from their seats, making their way to the back of the van. Only Harry remained in his seat, now suddenly fighting for control over his face as the twitchings of a smile assaulted his visage. I was frozen, forced to watch as the others stepped out into the void one by one, floating away into the infinite void. Some of them twirled as they flew, others turned around and grinned at me as they mimed swimming through the air. It was entertaining. I know I'll sound sadistic saying that, but at the time, that was just how it felt. Even with all my fear, I could still understand how they were feeling. The world seemed so wonderful in that moment, so much so that nothing could be looked at in a negative way. The void was dark, but it looked comfy. Their eyes were black, an amazingly dark black the likes of which I'd never seen. I felt the smile begin to rise on my lips, but I quickly pushed it away. I held my mouth tight and blinked rapidly, my heart beating out of my chest faster and faster. As I fought that battle, I saw Harry finally succumb to his urge. He stood, eyes already taken by the darkness, and made his way towards the back of the van. As his foot stepped from the edge, I finally broke free of my shock and dashed forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him back with all of my strength. His face stared back at me, grinning as if I was the mad one, ruining his fun. I pulled with all my might, grabbing one of the van's doors with my other hand as I tried to shut off his escape. The pull outside was so strong, yet it wasn't the slightest bit physical. My face was still twitching, and a warm feeling in my belly beckoned me out into the darkness. However, every time I looked out, my mind raced back to Joel. My best friend, the man whom I had had so many good memories with, taken from me. I refused to succumb to the blind comfort, the false hope. As I pulled with all my might, finally starting to make progress, my eyes were drawn to something within the void. Something now far away in its depths, still floating ever farther. To my utter terror, it was Joel, his body straight as he floated slowly down into the gloom. His hand was moving, and it took me a second to realize what he was doing. With that unnatural grin still on his face, he was waving at me. At that moment, I couldn't take it any longer. I pulled, and eventually was able to wrench Harry back into the van. As he fell onto his back, I grabbed the doors and slammed them shut. When they connected and sealed the exit, the whole van shuddered again, the overhead lights flickering on for a moment, then on and off repeatedly. I could see the whole van shaking each time it lit up, until, suddenly, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. I jumped up screaming at first. Or, at least, that's what the nurses said. It's a fuzzy memory for me. All I remember is the bright, glaring lights, the stark white walls, and the warmth of the hospital instilling me with dread. When I came to my senses, the doctors explained that I'd been found in an alleyway with severe bruising and several muscular tears. I asked them about Harry and the van, but they seemed to know nothing about it. I was found alone. I didn't even try to tell them what had happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and could have done without being locked up in a psychiatric unit. I stayed in the hospital for a few days before I was discharged, and the first thing I did was try to find Harry. It took me almost a week, but I did eventually track him down. He was in a hospital in a completely different part of the city, miles and miles away from mine, and even further from the place the van had picked us up. He was so relieved to hear my voice when I visited. His eyes remained black, the doctors diagnosing him with some condition or other to explain his sudden and total blindness. Only we knew the truth, and Harry, too, seemed inclined to keep it a secret. He never did get his vision back. For the first few months, I looked after him as got used to his new condition. Although he eventually moved away to be with family, we did keep in touch until his passing some years ago. As for myself, I spent a lot of my time after that researching events similar to mine, desperate to make sense of what had happened. I never found anything, and was eventually forced to give up. I tried my best to go back to living a normal life, and for the most part, I succeeded. Though, every time I see a white van rolling down the street, I still feel my stomach drop. It's irrational, I know. I'm as certain as anything that the van, and the driver had nothing to do with it. The fault, if anything, was ours. It pains me to think that we, in our youthful arrogance, doomed that innocent man to a fate still unknown. And that concludes my story. I know most of you reading won't believe it, and that's fine. I just hope that one day it can serve as a comfort for the next person who finds themselves a survivor of that horrid place. And remember, because this part is important. If you ever find yourself in a moment where you are so blissfully happy, a moment that seems to transport you, one you feel like you could stay in forever. Whatever you do, don't smile. There was always something about life in the city. The shape of the towering structures that surround you. Not unlike dense towering trees surrounded by a dense mist of fresh air. The absence of natural shapes stings the eyes. The breeze that glides off the surfaces of these windowed monoliths is sharp. Every point where two walls meet into a sharp corner felt out of place. Continuous flatness, yet stopping at every angle, violently redirecting its non-shaped surface. Yet everything perfectly placed for humans to touch. Everything meant to guide you. There is no exploration, no sense of misdirection. Even if you were to get lost, you never ended up in a place where nothing is. The streets guide you in their desired direction. Every guardrail serving to stabilize each step you take, each stair step perfectly spaced to assure you never stumble. Signs in the streets crowd where the sky would be seen to make sure you are never where you aren't supposed to be. Yet it never felt like you were meant to be standing in that place. The unnerving feeling of unnaturalness is further accentuated when the sun hides away, bringing in the night. Streets now empty, sidewalks devoid of the bodies meant to walk over them. The traffic that packed the streets now lay barren. Where the shadows that would be cast by the towers, now, pure darkness. During the middle of the night when all are now asleep, walking through the streets feels unwelcoming. As if I was not supposed to be there. These shapes that meant to guide me, now shaded in darkness, only confuse the eyes. My absence from the labyrinth will be forgotten in time. After a few days, it will be as if I never stood there, my presence that once was perceived by the passerbys will gone, as if I was never there, leaving no marks of my existence. The labyrinth will not remember me. As the raindrops merge on the windows of the moving bus, I pull my hand within my sleeve to wipe down the condensation blocking my view. Past the falling rain, I could draw out the figure of a cabin among the trees. My new home is waiting for me. Away from the daily routes planned for me by the signs and the guidance of the straightness of the sidewalks that led me to my destination like a train on tracks. The sound of the bus making its way over the old unkempt roads have been the only sound inhibiting my mind. The only thing resembling a guide was the one sign we passed days ago welcoming me to a town whose name I've already forgotten. The coldness of the air-conditioned cabin of the bus paired with the warmth of my thick olive coat gave me a sense of peace. It's been a lonely journey. The bus had been empty since the last stop before entering town. My only companion being the single book bag filled with the few things I kept after leaving behind all the unnecessary things that had anchored me to my life in the city. As the journey continued, the trees became denser, the road felt less and less paved. The bus stops. Hey kid, this is the last stop, no more road past this. The bus driver gripped the mechanism opening the door. He made a pointing gesture, directing me to get off. Walking down the steps, I mutter one last, "Thank you," before turning my back to embrace the cold but inviting breeze that pushed against my face. Before the door closed, I heard the driver clear his throat to get my attention. "Ain't much to do here, kid, just trees, holes in the ground and a lot of nothing else. This bus only comes down this far once every 2 weeks, so keep your head screwed on tight till I stroll by again if you plan on going back." I nod my head to him. I'll keep that in mind, plus. Walking farther past the last step, I feel the mechanical doors close behind me, signaling that it's past the point of no return. I turn to watch the bus leave. The fog ate up as soon as it takes off, only seeing the bright red taillights peering through the mist, even so they too would disappear. The droning sound of the engine that once filled my ears now suddenly vanish. The gray clouds that blanket the sky left not one space open for the sun to shine through. This place was shadowed by a gloomy atmosphere that for some reason felt comforting. It's quiet. Even under my weighted blanket in my compact concrete room in my apartment, I've never experienced such a silence. Before me was a dilapidated metal bus stop. Its bench meant to serve as a place to rest while the bus arrived was now overgrown with moss. The metal overhanging structure now lay in rust, and vines gripping its way up the columns. A few feet past the bus stop the sidewalk comes to a complete end. The structure of man, made to guide your way and steady your pace, now ceased. Past this was dense trees, all covered with moss and the floor littered with massive rocks. This is it. Past this point there is no more guide to my steps. Each new step I take will be one made with my own direction, not steered by a shape. No destiny written ahead of me. It frightened me as much as it invited me to walk forward. I looked up past the tree line and I could just barely see the shape of something unnatural in the distance. After hiking through the low-hanging branches and the dew-covered mossy stones of this forest, I arrive at my first reminder of what I once left. Before me stood an old-looking cabin, perched on top of what appear to be massive stones. The surface of the walls feel rough. I could sense the curving shape of the logs that made up the structure. Its roof covered in moss, dripping with water collected by the mist settling within its roots. Even though it was man-made, it felt as if it was a part of the forest. Like, if given enough time, this structure could form on its own through the process of nature choosing where it grows. Making my way in the inside feels welcoming. Across from the entrance was a fireplace made of the same stones found outside. Walking across the floors, I expected to hear the creaking of the wood, yet all that could be heard was the echoes of my footsteps bouncing around the empty space between the floor and the ground beneath the cabin. After settling in and tidying up the place, it felt more at home. Although I won't be spending much time here. Not too far from here there is a cavern that I read about on the internet that is doing tours at this time of the season, since the waters are frozen and the chances of the caves flooding are low. There was always something about caves that interested me. It's the farthest one can go within nature. The curiosity of exploration had pulled me here as if I was yanked by a leash around a collar. Even though its depths strike a sense of fear within me, the pull of the void was always greater than the fear. The same pull that drove me to where I stand now. The first night had passed. Now as I woke, I got everything ready to make my trek to the cavern tour. The morning was quiet. The mist pushed against the cold glass of the window, trying to make its way in through the cracks. As I packed my bag, I get this unnerving feeling of worry. I get this pull that leads me outside the cabin. Almost as if my subconscious heard a noise outside it wanted to investigate. I find myself standing on top of a stone outside the cabin. The pull is gone. Yet I still feel that unsettling feeling. Before I can take in the nature surrounding me, I feel the stone begin to tremble as if in fear. The ground shuffles slightly, but a low rumbling can be heard below my feet. It was a quick tremor that ended as suddenly as it appeared. After I went back to the cabin for my gear, I got that sense of worry again. But alas, I persisted through that feeling and began my hike to the cavern tour. I don't consider myself a superstitious person. Luck was always something I thought of as mere coincidences that happened to coincide with your intentions or defying your path. In the distance I can see the tour shack of this cavern, ecstatic to embark in my journey away from the outside shapes. Yet as I draw closer to the shack, I notice the crowd of people standing, waiting along, wearing disappointment on their faces, and I can't help but feel anything but unlucky. Among the small group of others wishing to go down this journey, I spot out a young woman in a uniform. I approach her, wondering what's going on. "Hey! Did I make it in time for the tour?" I ask her. The young blonde woman turns to me, wearing a worried look on her face. She lets out a sigh before confirming my suspicions of bad luck. "Sorry, we were just about to start the tour, but there was a quake and the entrance has caved in. It's gonna take days to get crews here to lift all these rocks out of the way, and who knows if the rest of the cave inside also collapsed." There it was again, that pull. Something within me pulling me down, anchoring me where I stood. And then, the stone upon which I stood cowered in fear again, trembling, but this time, more intense. The small group standing in front of what was once a cave entrance all stood apart from there in fear that more stones would fall. Then it stopped. the trees swaying from the violent shaking, now calming down into a smooth rustling. The wind howled as we all stood there wondering what had happened. The tour guide had advised us all that we would have to leave. I was disgruntled that I had come all this way only for the earth to deny me, telling me I was unwelcome in its depths, undeserving of exploring its veins. Almost as if telling me to return to labyrinth of man, and wallow in its room of edges. On my trek back to the cabin I felt an unnerving feeling that I had felt once, even though I was deep within the forest. Hopping and skipping on seemingly randomly placed stones and low-hanging branches, I felt that familiar feeling of walking on a sidewalk. That feeling that the path I'm walking is leading me by the hand, not straying off of it. The randomness of the forest somehow felt as if each stone I was stepping over was placed there for me to walk over, like the slabs of sidewalk. And every low-hanging branch I held on to so I didn't slip was lowered to my height like a rail to steady myself. Why did I feel this way now? There are no man-made shapes here in the density of the forest, but the familiarity of the proximity of it all made my stomach feel uneasy. I used to believe that destiny was a lie, that you are where you are supposed to be at this very moment, that where you will end up has already been decided by forces outside of your control. How preposterous to think that you are not at the helm of your own fate, is it not? I decide my path. Where I go in this world is only up to me. To believe that the stones beneath my feet have always been waiting millions of years for me to bear my weight upon them at this very moment, all culminating towards what? To believe that a tree which has been growing for hundreds of years grew this branch so that I may have something to grab so I don't slip on this rock covered in the dew of the mist. And now that I did, what? Is its purpose fulfilled? I never believed anything so presumptuous as that these things were arranged in this way to guide me in my destined path. But now, all that I used to believe has been put in question. As I stand here before where my cabin used to stand, now just rubble of stones. Where the massive stones that was the foundation of the old cabin once was, had slid down the hill they were perched on, and the cabin in thousands of pieces mixed with the small stones at the bottom of the hill. As I approach the base of where those stones once were, I'm struck with that feeling once more. The pole. Among the stones and moss now lay in the open the entrance to what seems to be a deep hole. Not steep enough to fall in, but just at the right angle as though you can enter with ease. The mist surrounded me as I stood peering into the descending abyss before me. I held my hand over the opening to see if there was air coming out, because that meant there could be an exit somewhere else. Yet I felt nothing. The mist that had settled over the ground began to be pulled into the opening, as if the earth was taking its first breath. The mist gliding down the stepped ripples of the walls as if unrolling a carpet for me to walk over. I could not escape this feeling. The call of the void was tugging at my neck to go in. Even though I knew it was a bad idea to go inside a cave that has never been explored, there was something telling me I was supposed to be the one to go in. For me to have been lead here. This vein of the earth which ended right behind the massive stones that once covered the opening, now finally exposed after I arrived. It's almost eerie to think that it had opened for me, to be explored and traversed by me and to see what lies at its heart. After equipping the gear I brought along for the cavern tour, I slowly began my descent. Each step I took going deeper and deeper felt like the cave itself was guiding me. The arrangement of the walls were always random, yet inexplicably to me there was always somewhere to put my foot on the way down. There was always a little indent in the wall where my hand fit so I could hold on to, as if it was carved out from below all the way to the entrance for me. Yet nothing felt like it was out of place. After meandering through the descent, I reach a flat area where the ceiling opens up. The light from my flashlight can no longer reach the ceiling. The light gets lost in the darkness consuming the cave. After pacing forward no more than 20 feet, the walls start to narrow again at a point. And at the end of this room there is a small hole. After exploring this room for a few minutes, there seems to be no other path but to enter this new tunnel. Not long after the entrance to this cave had opened and the carpet of mist led me down to this room, the mist floating just above the floor began to edge closer and closer to the tunnel I was debating entering. As if it was being breathed in by the cave, being pulled in along with me, eager to reach the depths. Reluctant to continue my journey, I stood before the hole, questioning if I should go further. The size of the hole being so low meant I would have to crawl on my knees. I took one look back at the path I had come from, taking one last look at the fading light of the entrance that was far above. While I was looking up at the distant opening which I had come from, I picked up a sound of an echo that came from the small opening. It sounded the scattering of rocks, shuffling about, then silence, and then a faint smack, as if a small rock fell from its place and hit a floor. Such an echo raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Up until now it had been dead silence. Even so, something in me pulled me to go farther. Regardless of the fright beating in my chest, I gathered my courage and persisted deeper within. Now brought to a crawl, going deeper and deeper in the tunnel, it felt so strange to me. The tunnel went straight forward. It gave me such an unnatural feeling. I had never heard of a cave going straight as if it were a tube. And it never shrank or grew. It remained the same size throughout the whole crawl. Had it not been for my light, I wouldn't have noticed when it came to a stop, the tunnel ending in an opening to a chasm. The light shone against the opposite wall. I peered down the ledge to see how low it went, and it looked like there was no floor. An endless fall awaited me if I chose to go further. My nerves had my hands shaking and I slipped my hand, my book bag flipping over my head and pushing me toward the edge. I managed to get a grip on the floor and halt myself from falling over the edge. Before I could react, the zipper at the top of the bag had slightly opened and one of the spare batteries from my helmet light fell through the opening, falling into the abyss. My hands were clawing at the edge as if I was still falling. Reconciling my emotions, for a few seconds, I finally heard the smack of the battery hit what I assume was the floor of the chasm. How long was that falling? I look over the edge trying to see if, now that my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I might see something resembling a floor to what I thought was an endless abyss. Squinting to see past the darkness, I noticed something pierce through the dark voice, a faint, little glimmer of light. I did a double take trying to make sense of what I'm looking at. A very hard to notice glimmer of light shining, fighting its way past the dense darkness, hoping to be seen. And as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Now my curiosity had peaked. Could there be some type of gem big enough to reflect my light? Or could it be an exit? No way could I get to the bottom of that. There is probably no way down besides to rappel down with rope. Or so I thought. Just as I almost cast aside the guidance the cave had given me this far. I explored the ledge I was standing on, till my eyes met with the flat vertical wall behind me. There was a lower ledge to the side that I could jump down to. And another one. And another ledge. And another ledge. They were so oddly spaced, where it was never so tall that I could get hurt from the fall, but never so close that it felt like a short step. And yet it felt natural, not measured with precision and leveled, not cut to be perfectly flat. Somehow I still felt that familiarity. As if this was meant to be the path to take. I continued my descent further for what felt like hours, and always just when I felt like it was a dead end or a drop that I could not cross, there was always a stone placed where I could walk, as if waiting for me to notice it, to continue my journey down. As I stood still there I was hit by a silent whisper of an echo, coming deep within the chasm, sounded like the cave had spoken to me, calling me down deeper, calling for somebody to reach its deep floor. I could not shake this tension any longer. My desire to reach the end of this cave became unwavering. I had no desire to go back anymore. I began to trust the cave. The journey felt as if it had gone on for so long. Every time I thought reached a dead end, I scoured the walls for direction. And the cave would continue to lead me to my next path. The farther and farther I descend I begin to smell the faint scent of metal in the air. Almost like if there was iron ore exposed on the walls filling the air with the scent of its rusting. The walls that were once smooth now started to feel rougher as I made my way deeper. I began to feel more jagged edges along the wall and protruding stones piercing through the wall. I had reached a point where the only way forward was through a tunnel so small I was brought to lay flat and crawl on my belly. The cave walls now so rough it felt like sandpaper against my skin as I dragged myself farther along this chute, the ceiling of this tunnel dragging against my back, scratching it as I moved. I managed to reach an opening, and as I dragged myself out from the small enclosure my body aches from the scratches left by the pointy rocks that were scattered among the floor. The cave no longer coddled me with that welcoming feeling. It began to feel as if I was not being led by the hand, but dragged by the neck. How many hours had gone by? I could not remember now. I hoped to reach the end of the cave what felt like a few hours ago, but just when I feel like I've reached the last room, or peer over the next ledge, it goes deeper and deeper. After much meandering, I finally arrived at what I think was the bottom of the chasm that I had peered down many hours ago. I never thought the winding pathways on the way down would lead down here. Almost as if the cave was begging to be explored. My admiration of the wonders of this cave network had been cut short as my ears picked up the sound of rocks scattering above me, coming from the direction of the ledge where I peered down. And then suddenly I'm startled as I hear a loud smack hit the ground right behind me. Almost like the sound of metal clanging against the stone surface. I quickly jump and turn to face the direction of the noise, frantically pointing the light at the floor trying to locate what it is that hit the ground. My light catches on something off-colored, completely standing out from the dark gray monotone shades of the cavern walls. It was my battery, that had fallen some while ago. But, how? Where did the one that fell the first time go? As much as I looked around the floor there was no other battery around. The first time, what am I talking about? The first time. How did this just hit the ground now? I heard it hit the ground the first time. I aim my light up to see if I can spot the ledge from down here. It's no good, I doubt the light will pierce through the intense darkness. Looking up I notice something. It's barely visible through this consuming darkness above. A small faint glimmer of light. Coming from where the first ledge I almost fell from would be. And then, the light begins to flicker, and suddenly... darkness. A type of void-like, encroaching blackness that deafens even my hearing. In my panic I start shuffling through my bag to find another battery, not realizing that the one that fell was the only spare I had. Now that I find myself lost, wandering in this void, with my balance thrown off. I can no longer remember which direction I came from. I try to walk towards any direction hoping to hit a wall. My heart is beating as if it is fighting to break free from my chest. I'm alone, stuck in this pitch-black cave that no one even knew existed until today. And no matter how hard I try I can't see to find my way back. Hello? Someone, please, help me. I whimper out in fear, hearing my voice bounce off the walls of the cave. I follow the echo in an attempt to steer myself in any direction, carefully and slowly shuffling forward as to not fall off an unexpected ledge. At last, in my mindless stumbling, I hit a wall. The horizontal grooves carved out by erosion lead me to what I hope is some type of exit. The texture of the walls becoming more and more jagged and rough to the touch. The grooves lead me deeper down into the cave. I now don't know if I'm going further down, or in a different direction. It's hard to tell, as every rock is different than the last. Nothing feels natural anymore. It no longer feels like I'm being held by the hand towards a path of discovery. Now it is a desperate wander, unable to make sense of where I should go next. My feet start feeling wet. Had the fog which once entered the cave now covered the floor with water? My feet begin to slosh around the once still puddle of water that covered the floor, but it felt thick. The smell of iron is getting more and more intense, as if I'm surrounded on all sides with exposed or rusting to its core. The air is getting harder to breathe. Its toxicity made my lungs feel as though I was being constricted. My hand continues to stumble across the wall of the cave. The walls feeling even more dangerous to touch. I struggle to guide myself as I slide my palms across its surface, feeling the small piercing stones make cuts to my palm. Yet I don't take my hand off the wall, scared that I would lose myself in this pitch-black darkness again and won't be able to find my footing again. I persevere past the searing pain, gliding my hand across the wall, hoping I reach another way forward, until I feel it start to smooth out. It gets smoother and flatter as it continues, when suddenly my hand slides off the wall completely, as if I had slid my hand across a glass window. I felt up and down the wall, unable to make sense of it. It was perfectly flat. Up until now the walls of the cave had been random and protruding, as if carved by a stream of flowing water. I couldn't make any sense of it. Now I stand here frozen in fear, as my hand reaches what felt like the end of the wall. And I'm struck with a deep shiver as I glide my hand up and down the ending of this wall, realizing it bends and continues at what feels like a 90-degree angle. A corner. A perfect corner, so sharp I could cut my hand. Two walls perfectly flat and smooth as a panel of glass meeting at a perfect corner all the way down to the floor. My fingers reach the floor and dip into the water that had risen to my feet up to the ankles. I bring up my hand to my nose and the smell of iron overtakes my sense. It all clicked. Why the smell of iron intensified the deeper I went, and why my feet felt like they were sloshing around what felt like a stream of water, but heavier and thicker. As the fear of my realization sets in, I hear the beating of a heart, not just from my own chest, but now a beating loud enough to overtake my own beat. I put my ear against the wall. I can hear it, the faint beating of a heart, pulsating through the compact stone, trembling with each pulse. But how? How can I so clearly hear a heartbeat as if it were alive? As the beating went on, it started matching my own rhythm. My own heartbeat and the beating coming from the wall had completely synced. And suddenly, it stopped beating. The wall became still again, although I am unable to remove my hand from its surface. I pressed my ear harder against the smooth surface, hoping to hear its fading beat. Yet it didn't fade, it just stopped. I felt a weakness take over me, my body no longer able to stand on its own strength. I clutch my chest, attempting to take a breath, and I come to notice, I cannot feel my own heartbeat anymore. I can't remember what I was chasing down here anymore. What was the pull which had brought me down to this depth? Did I finally reach the end of the cave? I can feel the darkness overtake me. My body now floating over the thick waters, feeling myself getting pulled down. It feels deeper than it was before. My feet can no longer reach the bottom. my head barely staying above, attempting with all my strength to take a breath. As the piercing silence slowly starts to drone out and I sink deeper, it is broken by an echo of a voice from the direction of the chasm I had come from. "Hello? Someone please, help me."